Hello, advanced social psychology students. This is the lecture video part 2 for Unit 1, Module 3, Chapter 2 on social cognition. So if you've watched the first module for this chapter, the one on social cognition, you know that we've defined social cognition by saying that it's how we think and process information about social stimuli. So cognitive psychology is an area of psychology you may have already taken. If you haven't taken it already, you will by the time you graduate on the MSBS General Psychology track, because it's one of the required courses, and it's a course in advanced human cognition. And so we're going to take those principles that you learn in that course about how we learn and process information, and we're going to apply it to social stimuli. And so in part 1 of this lecture video, it's pretty long. It's like an hour and 15 minutes, might even been an hour and 20 minutes. We talk about how do we, learn, and how do we learn and get information into our system in the first place. So we talked about some basic principles from the psychology of learning, like operant conditioning and classical conditioning and observational learning. And we said through all of that and being exposed to information, we create schemas, and then we get new information in that allows us to either make our schemas larger and larger, or we actually create different schemas to be able to get all of the information that to process all of the information that we have. And we talked about how in doing assimilation, we have that assimilation resistance. We end up creating quite a few biases and heuristics, and we talked about a lot of those. The purpose of this video is to talk about how our feelings, our affect is just another word for feelings or emotions, how our affect relates to and is our cognitions, our thoughts. And this is true about social stimuli and about stimuli in general that aren't even social stimuli. So I'm gonna go very quickly go to where we are in the PowerPoint presentation. Here we are, affect and cognition. So again, we're going to talk about how our feelings affect our cognition, how our cognition affect our feelings, and then we're even going to talk about how we think about our feelings, our cognitions about affect. And this video will be a lot shorter. I think it'll be closer to 20 minutes. It should be less than a half hour anyway. Okay, so here we go. All right, so when we go, if you were to take an undergraduate course in psychology, some departments will have a course on motivation and emotion, or a course on emotion. For this, we could call it a course in affect. Now, the Department of Psychology at Cameron University, we don't have a course just on emotion. We sort of take this material and put it in a lot of the other classes. But there are several theories of emotion that you really need to understand. And we're going to talk about how these emotions end up affecting our thoughts and vice versa. So some of the theories of emotion that were created a long time ago, like we're talking late 50s, early 1960s. The first one I'm going to discuss is by Cannon-Bard. Again, this is very classic psychology. If you have a MS in behavioral sciences on a general psychology track, people are going to expect that you know Cannon-Bard theory, James Lang theory, Schachter's two-factor theory of emotion. This is very basic psychology stuff, so it's important that you do know it. Okay, so this is what Cannon-Bard said. What they're trying to do is explain how when we are exposed to like really things that make us afraid or excited, how we end up experiencing the emotion from this external stimuli. So Cannon-Bard, they think that when we're exposed to emotion-provoking events or stimuli, we quickly experience both the physiological signs and at the same time, simultaneously, the subjective feelings that we label as fear, anger, joy, etc. In other words, the emotions. They're going to say the physiological signs from our body and our emotions are going to happen at the same time. So here's the classic example that's in every textbook that you've ever read about this. What it's going to say is, let's say you're walking through the forest, la, 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 you're having a great time, nature is beautiful, life is great. And all of a sudden, there's a huge bear in front of you. Okay, the bear is the emotion-provoking event or stimuli. What Cannon-Bard says is that you are going to immediately have the physiological response of running in the opposite direction. You're running, your heart is beating super fast, your palms are sweating, your mouth is going dry. You're running, you're running, you're running. That's your physiological response. And at the exact same time, Cannon-Bard's theory says you're going to go, I'm afraid, I'm afraid. Oh, I'm really scared, I'm really scared. So Cannon-Bard says that we're going to have the physiological signs of emotion and the subjective feelings at the same time. Now, two theorists, James and Lang, on different continents, came up with an alternate theory, and so they never worked together. But the theory we call now the James Lang theory. They're both given credit for it, even though they came up with the same idea independently. And what they both said was it would not, from an evolutionary perspective, it's too much to expect a body to do both of these things at the same time. So James Lang says, first we have our physiological response, and then we have the emotional response. So Cannon-Bard says they happen at the same time. James Lang says, nope, it's the physiological first, then the subjective one. So James Lang theory says, when we are exposed to emotion-provoking events or stimuli, we immediately experience the physiological signs of the emotion. Then our awareness of the physiological signs of emotion lead us to the subjective feelings we label as fear, anger, joy, etc. Okay, so they're going to say we're walking through the forest. Oh, what a beautiful place. The bear. James Lang would say we're going to instantly have our physiological response. We're running in the other direction. Our palms are sweating. Our mouth is going dry. Our heart is beating it through our chest. Ah. And then we go, oh, wow, look, I'm running. I must be afraid. I'm afraid. Okay. So they say you have the physiological response first, the emotional response second. So James Lang would say you're in the theater and you're crying. You go, oh, this movie must be sad. Where Cannon-Bard says you're in the movie, you at the same time start crying and feel sad. Okay. Now, another man comes along, Schachter, and he says, he doesn't believe in with Cannon-Bard. He thinks Cannon-Bard are wrong, that they don't happen at the same time. But Schachter says, James and Lang, for your theory to work, every physiological response would have to be mapped perfectly with one emotion. In other words, crying would always mean that you're sad. Running would in the other direction with your mouth going dry and your palms sweating and your heart beating would always mean you're afraid. But that's just not true. Sometimes when we're crying, we're sad or we're super excited. I know I cried when my husband asked me to marry him, because I was super excited. I know I cry when I have like religious experience or spiritual experiences. We always joke that God is in my tear ducts, and so my grandmother used to say the same thing. So it doesn't map perfectly. It's not like if I'm crying, I know I'm sad. I might be sad. I might be super elated. I might be in some form of spiritual ecstasy kind of thing. So it doesn't map perfectly. Similarly, if I'm running with my heart beating, my palms sweating, my mouth going dry, and I'm running, it could be that I'm afraid in running away from something. It could also be I'm exhilarated because I'm running in a race. I'm having a ball. So Schachter says that this can't be right. What you guys have come before, we don't think that's right. So he comes up with another theory. His theory says, first we have the physiological response, but then he says we're going to have a cognitive search for the reason why. And whatever we determine to be the reason why, that's going to determine the emotion we're going to experience. So the definition on the screen, when we are exposed to emotion-provoking events or stimuli, we immediately experience the physiological signs of emotion. The physiological response leads us to cognitively search for the reason for our physiological response. Whatever we determine or attribute the cause will determine our subjective feelings, okay? So Schachter would say, we're walking through the forest. Oh, nature is beautiful. The bear. We immediately have the physiological response. So we're running in the other direction. We're running. Our palms are sweating. Our mouth is going dry. Our heart is beating out of breath. And we're running. We're running. And then we go, wow, look, we're running. I wonder what's causing this. And we look around. Oh, there's a bear chasing me. I'm scared. I'm scared. I'm scared. See how the physiological response leads to a cognitive search for the reason why. And whatever we determine the reason to be, that's going to determine the emotion that we're experiencing. Okay. So you're in the movie, you're crying, you notice you're crying, you go, what is the reason I'm crying? Oh, this person in the movie is dying. I'm crying. What is the reason why? My husband just asked me to marry him. I'm elated. Okay. So you're going to go through a step. Now, one of the things that I find fascinating with Schachter's two-factor theory of emotion is sometimes we'll make a misattribution. We will think that our physiological response is due to one thing when really it's due to something else. And so we'll have a feeling, an emotion that we'll experience that doesn't completely align with what really created the physiological response. So there's a pretty famous study. It's old now, but it was by Dutton and Aaron, and it was done in the British Columbia in a beautiful, like I don't know if you, what do you call it? Forest, no, like our national, oh my gosh, the word just escaped me, but a place where you can hike and everything. So it's in British Columbia. And there's an area where there's an old, not old, but a super narrow, rickety bridge. One of those bridges that just has like planks of wood with, a little bit of stuff holding it to get links holding it together. So if you're standing on this bridge, it's like swaying, and there's like rope handles that you sort of use to help you walk along this bridge. And this bridge is high above a deep gorge. So if you look down over the edge, there's a river and cliffs, and it's a long way down. If you fall, you're like dead, right? So this is like a scary place to be. And what Dutton and Aaron did is they had a physically attractive female confederate. In other words, someone who is involved in the experiment but the real experiments don't know that they're in on it, right? And she would stand sort of out in the middle of this bridge as it's swaying back and forth. And if a man came along the bridge and he was alone, she would say, hey, my name is so and so. Would you participate in an experiment for me? I'm going to, the University of British Columbia or whatever. Would you, be in this study for me? And most of the men said, sure. And she would say to them, okay, here's a picture. And she showed him a picture. And would you tell me a story of this picture? And that she'd record them. And then she'd say, okay, if you want to know about the results of this study, feel free to give me a call. Hint, hint, wink, wink. So she'd sort of flirt a little and give her number. Okay. And then the man would go on. So they also, this attractive female accomplice would also do the same thing on a very standard, super safe, very solid, secure bridge, also in the same area. And so again, if a man came along single, would you participate in an experiment? Yes, great. Here's a picture. Tell a story about it. Okay, if you want to hear the results of the study, here's my number. Hint, hint, wink, wink. And what they did is they looked to see what percentage of the men called her back and asked her on a date. They also looked at how much sexual stuff was in the story that they told. Okay, so they're basically looking for how attracted the man was to this physically attractive woman. And what Dutton and Aaron, what they found was that the men on the scary rickety bridge were like 4 or 5 times more likely to call her and ask for a date. And there was much more in their stories, sexual innuendo, compared to those on the safe rickety bridge. And when Dutton and Aaron went to explain their study, explain the results, they used Schachter's two-factor theory of emotion. What they believe is that those men who were on that scary rickety bridge that's swaying back and forth high above this deep gorge where if you fall, you're going to die. He believes that their palms were sweating, their hearts started to race, their mouths were going dry because they were scared of, because they're on this high bridge. But when they saw the female, the attractive female experimenter or accomplice, what they thought, what they attributed all these physiological responses to was to them thinking she was attractive and them liking her. And so their emotion was, I think I have it for this girl, not, oh, I'm scared because of the bridge. Does that kind of make sense? They've replicated the study, not Dutton and Aaron, but other people have replicated the study where the woman talks to the men right before they play racquetball or right after they play racquetball. And the idea is before they played racquetball, they don't have any arousal, but after racquetball, they're pretty physically aroused, and they end up finding the women more attractive. They're more likely to ask her for a date. Again, we think it's this misattribution. Instead of going, oh, my heart is racing, my palms are sweaty because I just finished playing racquetball, they're like, oh, I think I must really like this woman. So date tip, if you're not with someone, this is a social psychology class after all. Date tip is don't go to calm places. The reason why people will take someone out to dinner with calm music and low lights is because the low lights make the pupils of the eyes get bigger. And when we're attracted to someone, the pupils of our eyes do get bigger. So it makes the person think you like them, so then you like them more. So the being dark or being not bright light works, but the calm doesn't. You'd be better off doing a roller coaster ride, going on a roller coaster, go dancing, do something that gets the person's heart rate up. And so then rather than thinking that they're kind of out of breath because they're dancing or because the roller coaster ride was scary, they're going to think it's because they have a thing for you. Now, I tried to use this myself, but I learned that I throw up on roller coaster rides. So that wasn't as attractive on the date. So kind of use this as it fits your personality or your, you know what I'm saying. Okay, but that's Schachter's two-factor theory of emotion. So those three, the Cannon-Bard, the James Lang, and Schachter's two-factor, those are classic theories of how our emotions work. And the last one, Schachter's two-factor theory of emotion, you can see how our thoughts, cognition, plays a huge role. Basically, Schachter says that your thoughts will determine what emotion you're going to have, okay? Now, there's other research that asks very directly, okay, how does your mood influence your thoughts? And there's research that shows that your mood or your affect, your emotions end up influencing your thoughts or your cognitions in at least 4 different ways. And one is that your mood will influence how you perceive ambiguous stimuli. Now, what do I mean by ambiguous? Ambiguous stimuli is stimuli that it's not obvious what it is. It's not super clear. If it's unclear, it's ambiguous. So let's say I'm walking through the grocery store, la la la, with my cart, and someone hits my car. Well, why did they hit my car? Were they klutzy and they didn't see me? Were they being aggressive and they're trying to tell me to get out of their way? It's kind of ambiguous. The research shows that if I'm in a positive mood, I'm more likely to perceive that as, oh, they must have just they weren't paying attention. If I'm in an aggressive mood or a bad mood, I'm more likely to see that as they did it on purpose because, all right. So our mood will influence how we perceive ambiguous stimuli. Another thing is our mood will influence our memory. And the way that this works is that whenever we memorize things, when we're learning things, in addition to learning what we're actually learning, there are cues from the environment and cues from our inner environment, I don't know what to call it, your insides, that kind of get associated with the content of what you're trying to learn. And so when you're looking for a cue to bring this information back, you can use the external cues or the internal cues to get to that. So here's an example of a study that has nothing to do with mood, but will make it really clear how our environment can be a trigger for learning. They had people who know how to scuba dive, And what they would do is they would have them memorize a list of words either on the boat or underwater with their scuba diver equipment on. Then a week later, they came back and they had to recall the words either on the boat or underwater with all of their scuba equipment on. And what they found was if you learned it on the boat, you recalled more of the words on the boat than if you recalled them underwater. But if you learned them underwater, you recall them better underwater than if you were recalling them on the boat. So you can see when you have this match between the environment when you learned it and the environment when you go to recall it, you're going to remember more of it. Well, one of the internal cues is your mood. So when you're in a good mood, you're going to have better memory for other things that happened to you that you learned when you were in a good mood. When you're in a sad mood, you're going to have better memory for things that you learned when you were in a sad mood. If every time you are listening to these videos and studying your advanced social psychology, you're hungry, then when you go to take the test, by all means, be hungry. You don't want to be full. It'll be harder to recall the information. So our mood will influence our memory, because if you're in the same mood as when you recall it as when you learned it, you'll do better off. A third way is that our mood or our affective state influences the way information is organized in memory. And this is really strange. No one has any idea. Well, there are lots and lots of theories, but we don't really have a good idea of why this happens. But when you're in a positive mood, you include more stimuli in the same category than when you're in a bad mood, than when you're in a negative mood. So when you're in a good mood, this chair that I'm sitting in is a chair, but also this desk, I could sit in it. So it's also a chair. And in a good mood, this bookshelf that's to the left of me, you guys can't really see it. I could sort of shimmy in there and sit in it. So I could use that as a chair. So in a good mood, lots of these different things I'll put in the category of they're all chairs. But if I'm in a negative mood, this is a chair. This is not a chair. This is a desk. That is not a chair. That's a bookshelf. I'm going to be very strict about what goes into a perceptual category and much more limiting. We don't know, and we don't know why that is. Okay. So in a positive mood, we're going to put a lot more things into the same perceptual category. When we're in a neutral mood or a negative mood, we're much more strict. It has to be a chair to be called a chair. Okay. It has to be a desk to be called a desk. And because of that, it leads to the fourth one. We tend to be more creative when we're in a positive mood. And I know our culture doesn't show that. When you think of creative people, you think of, Picasso who, sliced his ear off, and the country musicians, my dog died, my wife left me, and it's great music, but we kind of have this idea that to be creative, you have to live a life of angst with lots of, horrible things happening to you and lots of deep negative emotions. But the reality is, the research is very clear that people are more creative when they're in a positive mood than a negative mood. So if one day you're in charge of an ad agency, you want to make sure that those people that are coming up with ads are very happy in their job. If you know you're trying to be creative, you want to go for a walk, do whatever you need to do to put yourself in a positive mood, because you will be more creative in a positive mood. Now, on the other hand, if you need to be very specific and dot every I and cross every T, like you're doing your taxes or something like that, you actually do better at that if you're in a negative mood. So if you're going to do something that's very super specific, negative moods might serve you well. But if you're trying to be creative, a positive mood will help your creativity. And we think it's because you're more likely to put a bunch of different things in the same perceptual category. It allows for more creativity. Okay, so these are the ways that our emotions can affect our cognitions, our thoughts. Now let's flip it. How do our thoughts affect our moods? Well, we already talked about Schachter's two-factor theory of emotion. Absolutely, right? Thoughts play a huge role. Schemas. So we talked about schemas in the first video on this for this week, for this chapter. A lot of schemas will have in them an emotional component. So you have a schema for what it is to go to a funeral. And in that, there's a negative emotion. You have a schema for what it is to go to a surprise birthday party. And in it are lots of positive emotions. You've got a schema for what it is to win a race or to win an award. And that's probably going to have a lot of pride and positive emotions with it. And so our thoughts will affect our emotions. In fact, in research, when they want to put someone in a negative mood, sometimes they'll say, we'd like you to sit down and write about the last funeral you went to, or write about a time that you were rejected by a partner, a time that someone broke up with you, a time that a friend betrayed you. They'll have people write about a schema in order to put them in a bad mood. And similarly, we can put them in a good mood by having them write about a time when someone gave a surprise birthday party for them. So schemas, which are thoughts, end up affecting our emotions. Also, our thoughts will influence our reactions to things, which then can end up affecting our moods. Previously, I was talking about you're going through the grocery store, la la la, and someone hits you, hits your car. We were saying how if you're in a good mood, you're likely to say, oh, they didn't mean to do that. But let's say you're in a neutral, well, let's say you're in a good mood. They didn't mean to do that. So how are you going to respond? Oh, I get distracted when I'm in a store sometimes. And the two of you end up having a nice conversation. Where if you're in a negative mood and that person bumps into you and you're like, they did it on purpose, that's your thought. So then because your thought is they did it on purpose, your reaction is going to be, you need to watch where you're going. I have a right to be here as much as you. Or you're going to come back with some negative response, which then the person's going to come back probably really negative to you. The two of you are going to have words and you're going to really be in a negative mood because you're going to have this really horrible interaction. Does that make sense? So our thoughts end up influencing our reactions that end up affecting our moods. And one thought that we have a lot is an expectation, right? An expectation is just a thought. So think about if my expectation is that a friend is meeting me at noon for lunch and the friend shows up at noon. I'm fine. I'm happy. My thought influenced my reaction to their behavior. I expected them to be there at noon. That's the thought. Their behavior was they showed up at noon. Everything's great. But if my thought is that we're going to have lunch at noon and they show up at 1, my thought is that we're having lunch at noon. My expectation is we're having lunch at noon. They show up at 1. My reaction is I'm going to be ticked. You've had me wait a whole hour. I've been starving. Like, don't you think my time's important too? Like, this is real. And so you can see I'm going to be in a negative mood. They did the same thing. They showed up. Well, actually, I changed it where they were showing up at noon. Sorry. If both times they showed up at noon, but one time I was expecting them at noon, one time I was expecting them at 11:30, I'm going to be angry if I expected them at 8:30. I'm going to be fine if I expected them at noon. Their behavior didn't change. What changed was my expectations, my thoughts. And so our thoughts can influence our reactions to what people do that end up affecting our mood. And the last one of these, I just find this one fascinating. This is research done by Wagner, and it's on thought suppression. And his very classic way that he starts his conference when he's presenting at a conference is he'll say, okay, for this weekend, it's very important to me that all of you try very hard not to think of a pink elephant. And of course, what happens into every single person's mind, what pops in, of course, is a pink elephant. And no one's thought of a pink elephant all week, but they are now because they're told not to. And if they really do try hard not to think of a pink elephant all weekend long, they will think of a pink elephant more than they ever have. Because when we try not to think about things, we end up leaving cues all around us of that thing we're trying not to think about. And most of the time when we are doing thought suppression, which we do terribly, we're going to fail miserably, we usually don't try to suppress thoughts that lead to really positive emotions. Usually when we're suppressing thoughts, we're suppressing thoughts that lead to really negative or scary or traumatic emotions and feelings. So we're trying to suppress these thoughts that actually lead us to think about the event more, which leads us to even more fear, more negative emotions, more anger. The very thing that we're trying to suppress, we end up really creating. A much better way to handle trauma or things when you're upset is to write about it. And there's a researcher at the University of Texas in Austin named Jamie Pennybaker, and he's found that just writing for 20 minutes about traumatic events, you can do it like every other day or a couple times a week, just for 20 minutes, hardly any time at all. When you first go to write about it, you'll be negative as you're writing, but in a very short period of time, you'll feel much better. In fact, he's found that even 6 months later, after just with three times of 20 minutes in 1 week talking about a traumatic event, he finds positive effects even 6 months later. So people who lose their job and write about it are more likely to be employed 6 months later. People whose spouse committed suicide and they wrote about it for 3 times for 20 minutes each time, 6 months later, they're less likely to be depressed. I mean, just tons of different lots of your students who write about negative emotions for negative events that happened to them. 6 months later, it shows that in that 6-month period of time, they visited the wellness center fewer times. In other words, they were more healthy. So thought suppression doesn't work. If you really are having some negative emotions and you're having a hard time regulating them because your thoughts keep coming up, you need to write them down, talk to a therapist. You need to not try to suppress them. Suppression doesn't work. The thought suppression will lead to the very emotion that you're trying not to feel. Okay, so that is how our emotions can affect our thoughts. So now we're going to talk about how our thoughts about our feelings. And I think your textbook does a fantastic job talking about this at length and really bringing home the point, talking about all kinds of cool stuff about how we are terrible predictors of our future feelings. So one study, I love reading about positive psychology and the happiness literature. And I was shocked to learn that they took people who won the lottery and people who had become paraplegics. And a year later, there was no difference in their life satisfaction scores. No difference at all a year later. So it's just crazy to me. If you ask people, if I win the lottery, will I be more happy 1 year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? We're like, yeah, I'll be more happy, and the happiness, I won't have any money worries. I'll be super happy and it will last for a super long time. And if I ask you, if you decide to jump out of an airplane, but the cord doesn't release and you end up as a paraplegic, do you think you're going to be miserable? And I'd go, yeah, I'm going to be really depressed. And yeah, I'm going to be miserable for a really long time. My whole life will change. I'll miss swimming. I'll miss dancing. I'll miss walking. It'll be awful. Yeah. And no, I'll be in a world of hurt for a long time. But the reality is when they looked at people who had won the lottery and they looked at paraplegics, yes, they were more happy and less happy at the beginning. But a year later, they were in the same spot. So we are not good predictors of our feelings at all. Okay. So that is the end of chapter 2 on social cognition. And I hope you enjoyed both of these lectures, and I'll see you next week when we get to the next chapter. Thank you.